Thank you so much, Mimi, for being with me today on the WaveCapital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment. You're my 84th guest on my podcast. How are you today, Mimi?
I'm great. It's great to be with you, Garrett.
Well, it's wonderful being with you. You're the former Assistant U.S. Attorney and Chief at the Southern District of New York in the U.S. Attorney's Office. You have been a legal analyst in the past and currently for CNN and MSNBC, also making appearances on podcasts, including mine. You were also the District Attorney for Westchester County up in New York. If for those who are not familiar with New York State, you're a current adjunct professor at Fordham University School of Law, and you freelance as a contributor for VOX Media or Vox Media. Mimi, when you think of relationship building in a team environment, what does relationship building mean to you, and what has it meant for your professional career?
I mean, I have always prided myself, working as a prosecutor in a prosecutor's office, team building and bringing people together is immensely important because nothing you do is really something you can do alone as a prosecutor. I mean, you can sit at your desk, you can do the research, but everything else requires you to work with both other prosecutors who you may be co-writing a brief with, or interviewing a witness together, or going through documents together, brainstorming together, just coming up with ideas or trying to figure out what a judge meant when they said a certain thing. And you're working very importantly and critically with law enforcement. I mean, those literally are our partners. And so we often refer to, for example, people who work on a trial together, meaning the prosecutors, the paralegals, the agents, who are assigned to the case. We call it the trial team. So everything about being a prosecutor is a joint enterprise, and you have to find things to bring people together. And I really prided myself on that, both as a line assistant and then later as a supervisor and overseeing, part of the Southern District office called the White Plains Division. Often there would be disagreements, particularly between sort of the agent side of the team and the prosecutor side of the team, which is very common. It's not acrimonious, but agents tend to have a very broad view of, hey, why can't we charge this? And they want to kind of go for the biggest charge possible. And that's literally kind of part of their job, is to push us prosecutors. And sometimes the prosecutors, though, part of our job is to push back and say, no, here's why we can't. And so you have to find common ground and really explain your reasons for things. You can't just say no to someone. You have to make it understandable in a way that doesn't sound condescending. So that I think is something that I really learned early on in my career, and that people counted on me for, to be a consensus finder as much as possible, bringing together people, both prosecutors and agents and other outside entities that, there are turf battles that happen all the time. So we have to work those out and become a team.
Talk to me about those turf battles. That's an interesting way of phrasing that. Yeah, tell me more about how relationship building would apply to quote unquote turf battles, because it's all about, right, representing clients in your particular area or discipline of the law, but also being a part of the Southern District. I would imagine, your counterparts working with them on cases, there has to be some type of overlap. So please explain more.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap. And the way that it works, let's take, for example, organized crime, which is an area that I worked in for about 8 years. If you think about it, the rule for federal prosecutors and federal prosecutions is that a case can be brought wherever sort of an act occurred, right? So you could bring it in New York if the conduct happened in New York, or Boston if it happened in Boston, et cetera. But within New York, there are different districts. There's, for example, the Eastern District of New York, which is, Brooklyn and other places. The Southern District of New York, Manhattan, the Bronx, other places. Well, organized crime, you can imagine, they're kind of all over the place, right? So typical Cosa Nostra family has people operating in all different boroughs. So let's say there's, evidence of a crime. This is what, mob prosecutors live to do, is to prosecute mob cases. Well, the FBI has its choice. Are they going to bring it to the Eastern District, to Brooklyn, or are they going to bring it to the Southern District? There literally was competition for that. And frankly, that kind of competition is healthy. It makes us better prosecutors because it's kind of like free market competition. You know, the agents are going to go where they're getting the best service. And so that's one example of a turf battle. And I would say that over time, the dynamic about that changed. Initially, it was very, competitive. And over time, we started working together more with other offices that we might have competed with, particularly not necessarily other federal offices, but offices at the local level. So state and federal offices, instead of competing for cases, would work together as a team. So those are the kinds of things I mean by turf battles.
And your career would have overlapped in the Southern District with your fellow prosecutor at the time, Ellie Honig, because he did a lot of work in the Southern District and being a federal prosecutor and overseeing a lot of criminal cases pertaining to, mafia related, gang related crime.
I was Ellie's supervisor for
Really?
several years. Yeah, he's younger than I am. But Ellie was like a superstar that I recognized from day one. So he worked his way up to become a supervisor. But yes, initially I was his supervisor, and he was a great prosecutor. He was as good a prosecutor as he is a legal commentator, which I think is saying a lot. So
Absolutely. And what type of conversations or the note taking that you would do or comparing notes? I mean, if he was seeing you as his supervisor, which you were his supervisor, so reporting to you, talk to me about what a typical day would be like where Ellie and his supervisor, Mimi, would be going over their caseload for the day.
well, I mean, the thing about Ellie, who's a little bit of an unusual example in this sense, there's some people that as a supervisor, you really have to check in with them on a daily basis. And the people that I worried about as a supervisor were people that I didn't see, right? The people who didn't come to me and ask questions, the people who weren't, struggling with things, frankly, because no prosecutor should ever think that they know everything. And even experienced prosecutors every day encounter new things, whether it be legal issues or ethical issues, how to charge a case, things like that. So as a supervisor over the years, I really wanted people to be coming to me. And if they didn't, I was a little bit worried. Ellie was an exception to that rule in this sense. Ellie would get in before anybody. He would be there at 7 a.m. And by the time most people were eating lunch, he had done as much work as most people do in an entire day. He's just
Wow.
truly one of the most efficient people that I've ever met, let alone, and that's saying a lot because I've met a lot of incredible lawyers and prosecutors who are highly, highly functioning. And so Ellie, really could do a lot on his own. He was very independent in a different way. And I think part of being a good leader and supervisor is recognizing that. Okay, I don't have to stay on top of Ellie all the time. He's going to come to me. I trust him. You build a certain kind of trust and confidence in certain people. That doesn't mean I didn't have confidence in other people. And it doesn't mean Ellie never came to me to ask me a question, and I still had to check his work. And of course, there were times when I would say, maybe let's not focus on this case, let's focus on that case. But he really is a person who just, and it was evident then, who knew how to cut through and figure out the forest for the trees, right? Because that's in any profession what you worry about, is the person that you're working with or who you're overseeing losing the forest for the trees. And that's I try to do that even now in news analysis, right? Like, let's look at the big picture. We can talk about this particular issue, but where does it fit into the big picture?
Yeah, that's a great way of analyzing it. And I love the fact that you highlighted the relationship building process between you and Ellie and really counseling him and telling him this is what we need to focus on, or this aspect of this case, or let's focus on this case as a whole opposed to this one. And Ellie was going into detail with my interview with him about the cases he worked on, especially as it related to organized crime in the Southern District. So what do you remember from your caseload? And obviously it being Ellie's caseload, but some of those cases where it's really hardened criminals. I mean, in the Southern District. So, what struck you about those cases? How did you learn from them? How did you prepare for them? And I'd ask Ellie, given the nature of the case or cases rather, the intimidation factor perhaps of being in a courtroom with these hardened criminals in front of a jury, of course, but how did you prepare knowing the type of defense that was going to be put up, to defend these hardened criminals? And you being a federal prosecutor, you have to make sure that you put the best foot forward, you present the best case possible, and the ultimate goal, of course, justice being served and putting these guys behind bars.
So I would say with organized crime, and I did other types of cases later, but this was, about 8 years of my 17 years there, both doing the cases and supervising. I think the thing about organized crime is, one, it's fun to do as a prosecutor. I mean, they're just really interesting, fun cases. They are as character filled as they seem in the movies and in TV. Like Sopranos was quite an accurate description. And given that, and given that so many of your cases are based on cooperators and developing cooperators, you do spend a lot of time with them. And so, you're sitting across the table from somebody who has pled guilty to crimes and taken responsibility, but going over everything that they know and everyone that they came in contact with over their life, preparing them for testimony. And you spend hours and hours with them. And you're talking about really serious crimes. It can be financial fraud crimes, it can be extortion, it can be assaults, it can be murder, it can be murder conspiracies, etc. But you also get to see a really human side of them. I mean, you're seeing someone every day and debriefing them. You do talk about, their family. You hear about their family. Maybe they're going into the witness protection program. You have to talk about who they want to take with them and, or who they're leaving behind. They talk about feelings of friendship that they had with their co-conspirators, but also friends who were in organized crime and how they feel about, giving testimony about those people or how they feel betrayed. And that's why they're cooperating. And so there's these very human emotions and details that you get to know about people who, in many cases, did really horrible things. Like I had one cooperator who his nickname was Frankie the Beast. I mean, and for the reason that he was kind of one of the enforcers. I had another cooperator who didn't have a very exciting nickname, Victor Teixeira, but he stabbed someone in the eye with a fork, like that kind of just violent, more, really kind of shocking conduct that he was also involved in many other crimes, but that one stood out. And I remember when he testified about it, the jury kind of, gasping, because the idea of that is just so awful. You start feeling it in your eye. So that's one of the things that was interesting to me about organized crime, was kind of this duality. I mean, it's true in other areas as well, but there is something, especially because we all see so much organized crime in movies and in TV. And then you meet the people and, a lot of them could be characters in one of those shows. And so it's one of the times when life and, art really do kind of reflect each other. And one of the families that I was very involved in prosecuting is called the DeCavalcanti family, which is actually it's kind of known as like the sixth family, because there's the 5 families in New York, and the DeCavalcanti is a New Jersey-based family. And they have like Sicilian roots, and they're a little less well known, but actually a lot of the characters in The Sopranos was based on the DeCavalcanti family. And when we had a trial, there was a recording of them. They didn't know they were being recorded, obviously. And one of the recordings is them talking about who's who in The Sopranos, like who's what character. And, we were playing that for the jury, and it was almost comical, but it's also very serious, obviously, to hear them, they watch it too, I guess. In terms of sort of we didn't, I'm guessing Ellie said this too, I think most organized crime prosecutors did. We didn't feel afraid for ourselves. The general sort of knowledge and consensus with this group in particular of people that were being investigated and prosecuted was that they didn't go after prosecutors or agents. They went, if they were going to retaliate against someone, it was cooperators. It was one of their own who had become a government witness. And many of the crimes that were charged were, something had happened, and then they were worried that somebody who was involved in that crime was cooperating, or they suspected they were cooperating. And so then they would go after that person, and then that would be charged as a crime. That was, it was this ongoing pattern, and then someone that was involved in getting the cooperator, then they were worried they were cooperating. So they would go after that. It just goes on, which is a really sad cycle to be in. And so, whether we were right or not, that was the general, I think still is, consensus based on, just years and years of how organized crime families operated. And so we didn't really worry about that. One of the cases I did, Ellie eventually did one of them as well. I did one of the several trials against John Gotti Jr. The Southern District of New York actually tried him, I can't remember now if it was 4 or 5 times. I did the third trial. I know there was at least one after I did it. He got a hung jury every time, which is highly unusual, both to get a hung jury that many times and frankly for an office to try someone that many times. But it was an unusual case. But I will say that trial was one of the more tense experiences I had, not because of him or even his lawyer, who was an experienced mob lawyer, but because of his family. His sisters, his mother, Victoria Gotti, would come every day, his brother, and sit in the courtroom and really sort of give me the stare down. And yeah, so that was the most tense that I have felt in terms of the atmosphere in a courtroom.
And when you were being stared down like that, what were you thinking?
It's, you want to be professional about it. First of all, I don't blame them. We're prosecuting their family member. From their point of view, this is why wouldn't they be angry at us and etc. I didn't feel scared. I felt more angry, I think, or annoyed. And, if it had been me out on the street, and someone was staring me down like that, I might have reacted differently. But because, you're a prosecutor and this is your job, you try to be professional about it.
Of course, of course. And you mentioned, and first and foremost, thank you so much for providing that insight because that's so helpful for my audience and me at home. And it's reminiscent of what Ellie was talking to me about and going into the finer details of his day to day. And it's very similar to what you're describing too. So thank you for walking my audience and me through all of that. Very fascinating because there's only a few, relatively speaking, people in this world who get to be in the position that you were in, so to speak, where you're representing, obviously, the Southern District and having to face on the other side people of this criminal, background and the nature in which they operate, which is obviously illegal and it is a threat to society. And although they operate in their own circles and they typically, to your point, would only retaliate against their own if they felt that they were cooperating with the feds, as it's described in The Sopranos or Goodfellas. They always use the terminology feds, as in federal agents, if you will,
Yeah.
or people who are in the legal community representing the district. But just really interesting insight, and I appreciate you sharing all that. The other 9 years of being in the Southern District, what are the other cases that you would work on outside of organized crime that you also felt were, as you put it, fun?
Yeah. And I sort of saved the fun term more for the organized crime world, I guess, in the sense, I love being a prosecutor, everything about the job. It's sort of the privilege of being entrusted with that kind of responsibility and working Ultimately, though, the cases I really came to love, and this was part of my motivation to run for DA later, were the victim-based cases. And by that, I mean, individuals who either were lost a lot of money, civilians, not people in organized crime, people who were physically harmed. So after I was chief of organized crime, I ended up supervising the younger people in the office, which was actually really fun. I supervised the sort of brand new prosecutors called the General Crimes Unit. And so I got to meet a whole other generation of people who were coming into the office. I mean, those were people, I'd been in the office now 10 years. So people far younger than me and less experienced. And I remembered that feeling when you're a new prosecutor and you feel overwhelmed a bit and you're just learning everything for the first time, but you also have this kind of excitement in the beginning. I mean, it lasts, but that newness of like, wow, I can't believe I get to do this. And so that was really to do that sort of 10 years in and get to encounter, and I'm still friends with many of them, and see the office and the job through their eyes and how it had changed and all of that. So I did that. And then I went and became supervisor of the White Plains Division, which is the one satellite office outside of Manhattan that is part of the Southern District. And so we do everything in that office. So meaning, whereas the main office is divided up into different units, securities fraud, narcotics, gangs, organized crime, White Plains office just does everything. So I oversaw all the different cases. And one of the areas that we had a lot of cases in, and I did a lot of hands-on supervising, were unfortunately human trafficking, sex trafficking, and sexual exploitation of children, especially online. And so that became something that I became very invested in. I was a mother of young children. I mean, I am a mother, but at that time I had young children. And it was just shocking, like how young some of these victims were and how easy it was for some of them to get lured in online, and how much of it could be prevented. I felt, a lot of us felt, the FBI agents who work on it, not only FBI, there are other agencies whose agents work on it, but FBI in particular, just really talented, dedicated people who were dealing with the most excruciating things. I mean, you had to either watch these videos or read the, transcripts of them, and even some of the chats that you're reading. And it's terrifying because as a parent, you're thinking, God, this can happen in a second. This crime of sextortion, for example, where someone gets a minor to send them something compromising. It may not even be complete like child pornography, but something that they're going to be embarrassed about if it gets exposed. And the person who may be pretending to be a teenage girl or a teenage boy, or or they're preying on somebody because they have such a vulnerability. And then next thing you know, they're saying, well, if you don't send me a naked picture now, I'm going to expose to all your friends. I'm going to put this on, Instagram or Snapchat and tag you, and all your friends will know X, whatever it is. It could be an embarrassing fact. It could be an embarrassing picture, whatever it is. And now they're stuck and they're controlled by this person because they, kids, and these are often kids, whether they be teenagers or younger, aren't going to necessarily run and tell a parent. They're embarrassed, and so much of it, we realize, could be prevented. And if you educated both parents and young people about, first of all, not everybody is who they seem on the internet. Someone may say there was this one picture that we would use in these lectures or talks that we would do at schools that showed this older, very large man, like sitting in his basement at his computer. And then you see the text and he's saying, yeah, my name is Susie and I'm 13. Like, you don't know, you have no idea who's behind that. And so that it's such an obvious thing, but not an obvious thing to people who are just learning to use the internet and social media, and parents who may never have used it and don't know like all of the different, it's hard to keep up and to know how they're communicating with each other. And to know that the worst thing you can do is if you do make a mistake and you send somebody something or you tell somebody and then you realize, it wasn't all what I thought it was, don't just give in to it. Go and tell someone, go and report it to the police. Like, there are things absolutely you can do. So things like that. And that became kind of a passion of mine, to go around to schools with FBI agents who worked on this and give talks that frankly scared kids, when we would give them the talks. But, it's kind of like talking about drinking and driving. Like, you kind of have to to make an impression. So it's hard to use the word fun with any of that, but it felt really meaningful and really important. And I liked that there was something we could do beyond just, though it's important, beyond only, I use that in quotes, air quotes, prosecuting cases. We could also try and do something to prevent it. And that's something I carried over into, again, why I wanted to be DA, because that's a place where there are a lot of crimes that absolutely need to be prosecuted, especially victim-based crimes, but there's also a lot you can do in terms of prevention.
Sure. And I think going back to when you were discussing the organized crime cases and you used the terminology or used the term fun, just for my audience at home, because I understand the context, you probably mean fun in the sense of maybe intellectually challenging, or, it makes you think about or how you approach a case. Am I correct saying that?
Yeah,
Or
yeah, absolutely.
how would you describe just both sets of cases and putting in context how you were framing that?
I mean, I think these kinds of cases were more rewarding. They felt more satisfying and rewarding in the sense of, you're really stopping one of the worst things that can happen ever, maybe putting aside murders of, innocent people. So I would describe these cases as very fulfilling in both stopping something horrible from happening, if you can, sometimes just holding that person accountable or people. With some of the human trafficking cases, I mean, we literally had a case where a young woman, not a minor, I don't think she was a minor, but a woman was being held essentially against her will in a apartment by some men and was raped, and they were going to traffic her, and the police and the FBI were able to rescue her. I mean, that's pretty incredible to be involved with something like that. And then again, because there was this other component tied to some of these cases where I felt like, we would reach out to schools in particular and go and talk to young people. And, you never know who maybe you prevented something bad from happening.
Well, it's definitely, and I love how you said rewarding and satisfying in the sense of, being that you're a mother and I'm a father, having young children, and now your children are more grown up. And I have a young child, one on the way. My wife is 12 weeks pregnant, so we have a second one on the
Ah,
way, but our son is almost 3 years old. And, his safety is, and our future child safety is the most important thing. And it is frightening, it is terrifying that for someone like you who has been in that position as a professional to prevent these crimes, but knowing in the back of your mind that, well, you have children at home too. So it really hits close to home, and it definitely takes on a different meaning. So, how were you able to compartmentalize all of that? And when you're having to read certain things or see certain things during these cases, it probably, I don't want to use the terminology because I'm not a medical professional, but was there any type of post traumatic stress disorder in the sense of like what you had experienced having to prepare for these cases, and the things that you read, the things that you had to see that were either recorded and for the purpose of you doing your job effectively and putting these people behind bars and being the federal
yeah.
prosecutor that you were. So how are you able to just compartmentalize all that and just be in the right frame of mind and not try to be so emotional or take the emotion out of it, where you could just be, like precision, just not get distracted and just really just focus on the case at hand and not think like, wow, God forbid this was ever an issue or ever applied to my life.
Yeah. So, first of all, one good way of answering that is to explain that the FBI, at least when I was in the US Attorney's Office, I can't say whether it still exists, but had a rule that agents who worked on these types of cases had to rotate out of that, were supposed to rotate out of that area of work like every 4 years, because it's understood that this is a traumatizing type of work to work on. And in the US Attorney's Office, at least in our office, there was kind of a understanding that if there were people, prosecutors who said, I don't want to work on those kinds of cases. I don't want to work on child pornography cases. I don't want, it's too upsetting to me. That was generally honored. And you can't say that about most types of cases. And again, these are the same people, who also could be working on, myself included, like a morbid, grotesque, murder case. But it gets at a different part of human emotion, when you're talking about kids being abused. And when I was DA, there were a lot of child abuse cases, not even just sex abuse, like just physical child abuse. I mean, that is a common crime. And, it's just shocking. So, I mean, I would be, disingenuous if I said none of this had an impact. Of course it did, particularly as a mother, but I think just as a human being, that and, animal abuse too, right? Like they're just things that make your blood boil and things that you can't take all emotion out of it. I think that's unrealistic. That's why they have lawyers to advocate on their behalf and, try to sort of get through that. And, I think in terms of compartmentalizing, I mean, I will say that prosecutors there is a certain shield that you develop. I mean, I would sit and look at pictures of grotesque murder scenes. And I mean, obviously, I would feel completely sympathetic for the victims and their families, especially when I met with them and talked with them. But I could look at those pictures without becoming physically ill, whereas I'm sure a lot of other people would feel physically nauseous looking at them. You just develop a certain tolerance, I guess, in the same way that doctors do, right? I mean, they probably look and see and deal with a lot of things that most people just can't even imagine dealing with. And that's part of it being a profession, is that you have to. I think the child involved crimes are the hardest for that to happen. I don't know that you ever develop any kind of real, sort of shell or shield that can stop that awful feeling. And they are the cases that sort of stick in your brain, the most, I think. They're the hardest to get out of your head.
Sure. And that shield that you talk about that protects you from an emotional standpoint, although you expressing your sympathies and deepest condolences to the families, I mean, you're doing your job, and that shield that you speak of allows you to see those pictures and review facts and not, as you said, get physically ill from being exposed to all that, because that's a part of your profession. And that's really what makes you so special in what you do, because you are in the role of protecting society. You are in the role of protecting children. You are in the role of protecting anybody who has ever been, physically abused or mentally abused, whether someone is underage or not. And it's truly upsetting that we live in a society today where we hear about these human trafficking cases, and we hear about how there are so many innocent people who can't defend themselves, and that, God forbid, if there's extortion or they're just held against their will, or that you were saying earlier that they can't go to their parents because they're embarrassed. And it's so tragic that it's like they can't find their voice. They can't have a place to go to. And that's why it's people like you that it's so admirable and noteworthy for you and your colleagues to go to schools or with law enforcement and educate these students. And although that you have to educate them in their schools at a younger age, they need to be aware of all this, because not only are you putting them and empowering them to be in a position to say something if they hear something or they learn about something, right? You're able to empower them to speak out, but also the fact that you have the tolerance for that, but that you are, or God chose you for the role that you're in, and that you've done it or had done it for so long, and that you were able to, for many years, representing, victims families, or they could be victims but still alive depending on what the matter is, or the matters are. That, thank God that there are people like you out there, and Ellie and others, who really are the eyes and ears and the witnesses to all of these, all of the injustice that you're trying to get justice served. And I just have to commend you for all of that. And that's, for my audience at home, people who are aspiring to be in the legal profession, who are aspiring for this line of work. I'm sure that that's impacting them hearing you speak today.
Thank you.
What do you love about when you appear on CNN and MSNBC and other media platforms? Because obviously that is another profession of being a journalist, or being someone who is a commentator or an analyst, and being able to take what you do in the legal world and then to be able to have that extrapolate out to, somebody who is a person who is informed and informing our citizenry of our country, and being able to speak on all these different networks and other local digital platforms, if you will, whether locally in New York or being seen across the country or around the world, especially CNN being a global network. So, what do you like about commentating? And that's a whole relationship building process too. When did you ever think that when you were Ellie's supervisor in the Southern District of New York, that you both would be appearing on CNN many years later, talking about these matters, and how what you learned or what applied in your profession can apply to the things that we learn about on a daily basis, what's happening in our federal government, what's happening with the Trump administration, and that you're able to take your expertise and then educate the public. So we'd love to get your thoughts on that, especially in the context of relationship building.
Yeah, I mean, if you had told me when I was in the US Attorney's Office that I would be talking on cable news about even one time, let alone, over the course of years, I would have said you were crazy. Like it was such a foreign concept. Prosecutors, especially in the US Attorney's Office, are taught, like the press is kind of, well, it's a little bit different now, but at least how I was trained, the press was not your friend. You didn't try cases in the media. You didn't talk to the media. It was considered like if you were going to trial talking about a case, and I mean, obviously, as a line prosecutor, you would never, but even the US attorney, you would not go out and talk about a case because you could prejudice the case. And judges were very strict about that. It's actually something we see far too commonly now from this Department of Justice, but we won't get into that here. I mean, they do talk to the press in ways that are not appropriate. But so meaning it was very, the whole idea I would have said, absolutely not. I'm not going to go talk to the press. But I felt there was a real need for it, particularly at that time, like 2017 around is when I left the office. And that was when we were first starting to hear kind of these broad-based attacks on the Department of Justice, the FBI, like the world that I grew up in, that I never in a million years thought was perfect, but I believe in those institutions and I believe in a lot of their major principles. And I believe and still believe that there are a lot of good people there who are really trying to do the right thing. And when I started hearing these very broad-based, broad-brushed attacks about, the deep state and, DOJ, being corrupt, et cetera, I at least I viewed it as sort of an educational function, really, because I knew, and we all know that, most people don't know how the Department of Justice has operated for decades and decades and why that matters and what it means to say that, prosecution should be apolitical. And again, not that everybody always got that right, but as a general matter, and what some of the norms and guiding principles are of that institution, and why, like, I served under Republican and Democratic administrations. I served under several Republican presidents, and, it just was not an issue. There were things that changed, but it was the basic principles stayed the same. And so I viewed this opportunity to talk to people, the American public, about things that they probably didn't know much about, at a time where it all of a sudden seemed and felt more important. In the same way that you have again, to use the doctor example, during COVID, we needed doctors to go on and explain to us. And of course, there are differing views, but one thing I'll say, because I think you used the word journalist, I never viewed myself as a journalist. I still do not view myself as a journalist. I am not a journalist. I use the word analyst, commentator. In other words, I don't go find the facts. My job is not to report something that happened or figure out what happened. That is a reporter and a journalist. My role in this area, I view as analyzing what the reported facts are, or the known facts, or maybe it's something that happened in a court proceeding or something like that, through the lens of my training and experience as a prosecutor, as someone now who ran for office, whatever the sort of background is, but mainly as a lawyer / longtime prosecutor, both at the state and federal level. So I view it as, this is the thing I can, the lens I can use that not everybody has, to try and help understand things that are going on.
Yeah, and well said. That makes perfect sense. And how you characterize it, that's right, because whether it's Ellie Honig, Jeffrey Toobin, Joey Jackson, all whom have come on CNN and talk about, specific cases, as we've seen in this administration or even previous administrations when they've been a part of CNN for many years. And the reason why I bring up journalism is that although you are an analyst or commentator, one in the same description, would you consider yourself a journalist when you've had to, let's say, contribute, commentary in the written form? Would you consider yourself a journalist then, or just as not so much a journalist, but maybe just somebody who is basically taking what she says on TV and then just reducing it to writing, where you might see it as, okay, I've written some articles here, I've contributed my knowledge there, but I wouldn't call myself an everyday journalist?
It's just not a term I would use. Maybe, I haven't thought about it that deeply, but I definitely view, the writing as well as something where I literally am looking at what reporters are reporting, what the news is saying about things that are happening, and trying to put them in a context and analyze them. I guess someone could argue that is what opinion journalists do, maybe
Sure.
not reporters, but opinion journalists. So, maybe I should add that to my list of things I've done.
I would say you're an op-ed. You write op-eds.
Right.
And
Definitely
so,
write opinion pieces. Yeah.
definitely. And comparing what you did with the Southern District of New York to what you did as the DA for Westchester County, I know you touched upon it previously, but just to emphasize the differences, did you love the change from the Southern District to Westchester County? How much of the pace changed, being that you're leaving Manhattan to go up to Westchester? So just curious in terms of the caseload, or just the day to day, or just how you prepared, or just the feel of everything.
So, yeah, in terms of being a DA versus being in the Southern District of New York, it's not so much really. Some of it is that it was two different offices, two different jurisdictions, and we can talk about how they operate differently, but it was just a completely different role. So when I was in the Southern District of New York, I was a line prosecutor and then a supervisor, and oversaw a division of the office. but I was not the principal of the office. I was not the U.S. attorney, right? That was, well, different people. The last one that I served under was Preet Bharara, who was there for 7 years. And before that, were many different people, including Mary Jo White and others. So that would be more comparable to when I became DA, the difference being those are, the district attorneys in New York are elected positions, U.S. attorneys are appointed, but I was the principal of the office. I oversaw the entire office of about 135 attorneys and, a whole team of investigators and staff. So, the whole office, I think, is about 250 people. And so it's just an entirely different role. I mean, in terms of team building, it's the entire office now. It's not a trial team. It's not even just one, unit that you're overseeing, or one agent or team that you're working with. It's every law enforcement agency in the county of Westchester, which is a county of 1 million people. I actually was quite familiar with Westchester because when I oversaw the White Plains Division, that is in Westchester. So I had worked with a lot of law enforcement and had worked with the Westchester DA's office, but I had never been the principal of, the entire office before. So that was a completely different experience. And I loved that in a very different way. It wasn't as much about working on individual cases, although I was a very hands-on DA and did get in the weeds on a lot of cases and liked that a lot. But, it's also just a management role, and it's a kind of diplomatic role when it comes to other agencies and other, not just law enforcement. I mean, as a DA, you're an elected official along with other elected officials. I didn't think of myself that way in the same way that maybe other DAs do. I really thought of myself more as a prosecutor than an elected official, which, created a little bit of maybe tension. But yeah, so just a very, very, not just a different jurisdiction. Prosecutors' offices in general have a lot of similarities and kind of cultures. And I think they just attract a kind of person who, could be making more money. I mean, these are lawyers who could be making more money somewhere else, and they're doing this because they love the work and they want to work with victims and help people and try to be on the right side of justice. And so, that's what I love about both offices. And I love the people. I love the kind of people it attracts, and I like the work, but they were two very different roles for me.
Well, I really appreciate your time. And final question, what does your family mean to you? Obviously switching from your professional life to your personal life. You mentioned being a mother, having kids. I saw your dog walk into your room. I'm sure your dog you love so much. My wife and I, we love animals too, and she's had dogs in the past. I've had smaller animals, but what does your family mean to you? And from a relationship building standpoint, having that work-life balance, I'm sure, being in the career that you are in or was, but still very much involved in the legal aspects of being able to explain all that on network television, but achieving that work-life balance and then raising a family, what advice would you give to people who are also raising families? My wife and I are raising our young son, and then we have another one on the way. But what advice would you give to my audience too? How to balance your career life with your family life, and then any final thoughts about relationship building, and you can tie it both together if you like.
Yeah, I mean, look, first of all, I've been incredible. I mean, in terms of the work-life balance, I'm very, very lucky, happy to have a great partner. My husband we are partners, like we support each other and help each other in every way that we can. And so that I think has been part of my ability to juggle. I always say to people, young people that ask me the question about the work-life balance, I usually say there is no one balance, actually. Like if you think you're going to find that work-life balance, stop looking, because really what happens is I think different things in your life take priority at different times. And you're going to have times where you have to give your all to work, right? For prosecutors, it's when you're on trial, you just have to drop everything else. Like you have to line up childcare, your partner has to step in, you have to get extra babysitters or bring family in or whatever you can do. And, that can take a lot of resources, but if you're a prosecutor, that's what you got to do. You are on 24/7 for when you're on trial. You're not exercising, you're not, probably eating very well, you're not sleeping a lot. You get the adrenaline and you plan for it and you go. And people do it. And then it's over and you usually get sick right afterwards because your body crashes. But, then you go back to normal life. So that's a time when that's just one extreme example, and there are others less extreme, and every profession has them where your work is the priority for those, whatever it is. It can be a week, it might be a 2-week trial. Sometimes trials take months. Similarly, there are times when you have to give all your attention to your family. There could be a crisis. Someone could get sick, someone could get hurt, and you have to be able. And I think, I realize it's a luxury in a lot of jobs, but I had this, and I tried to respect it as a supervisor to be able to say, guys, I can't today. Like today I got to be home. Today I got to take care of my kid. Today I've got to do this. And when other people came to me and said they needed to do that, I really, and you hopefully have the kind of coworkers that step in, or you say, you know what, not everything has to get done today. Sure, I'm the kind of person that wants to complete my to-do list, but maybe I'm not going to get everything done on the to-do list. And it may be longer periods. I'm not just talking about crisis. Kids at different ages need different kinds of attention. Young kids need you physically present more. Older kids, I have teenagers, they don't necessarily want me around all the time, but when they need me or when I need to be with them, it's more concentrated. Overall, I think that I would say that, my kids saw an example of someone who, two people, me and my husband, who love what they do. And that's one of the most, that's one of the things my parents passed on to me. And I hope that's something I can pass on to them, is find something that brings you satisfaction, joy, whatever the thing is. That's the prime example of sort of teaching by example to your kids. So I fall back on that a lot if I were, but I don't feel like I was lucky. Like, I don't feel like I missed out on a lot. I feel like I was able to figure out when to be around and when it was okay to step back.
Of course, and I think you and your husband did a phenomenal job raising your children, and marriage is a lot about sacrifice. And I love how you refer to your husband as a partner, because it's how I look at my wife and how she looks at me. We're partners, and you and your husband are partners, and you have kids, and my wife and I have kids. And for all the families out there who are fortunate to have children or be godparents and or being uncles and aunts and caregivers and to loved ones, that you have a responsibility in society to help society by raising your children the best way possible, and for them to be model citizens, and they learn by examples of, whether you or me in our respective families, like my wife and I setting examples for our kids, and you and your husband setting examples for your kids. And that's the greatest job, is to be parents. I mean, some of my other guests have said that, despite all their accomplishments, they would say that the greatest role is to be a parent. So I definitely sense that about you, especially in the career that you are in, and part of your career, or throughout the decades of, again, going back to protecting children and making sure justice is served, and making sure people who have committed heinous illegal crimes of any types, whether it's targeting children or whether it's committing murder or whatever the case may be, or trafficking people or drugs or whatever the case may be, that you and the type of person you are, making sure that justice is served and those people are thrown behind bars, and put behind bars rather, and then going out of your way, rightfully so, taking time out of your busy day to go to schools and counsel children and say, this is what you need to look out for, and this is what you could do to protect yourself and your friends and your family and what have you. So I just want to thank you so much for being my 84th guest on the WaveCapital's guest speaker series on relationship building and team environment. Definitely need more people in the world like Mimi Rocah and people like Ellie Honig and others who, have really have put yourselves out there in your careers to fight the good fight, to make sure that justice is served, and to make sure that you're making society a better place to live in, to thrive, to be safe and protected. And, for my wife and me raising our son and our future one, God willing, on the way, that we know that there are people like Mimi Rocah out there, the Mimi Rocahs of the world, who are, doing their best to keep our society safe. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll keep trying, and appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about all this.
Really enjoyed our conversation about relationship building and team environment. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and weekend. Take care.
Too. Thanks.
Bye bye.
Bye.